So Will Handley, who will talk to us about scanning for cosmological tensions across a DiRAC-enabled grid of models, datasets, and samplers.
I'm sure I don't need to introduce too much that people have talked about tensions for the past 5 years or so. We've now been talking more about the actually exciting element of real data coming out of the DESI instrument, but tensions still abound, although less so than they used to. H0 still exists, although it seems to be being held up more by the force of Adam Rees's will than any actual sort of science or physics. The S8 tension seems to have gone away when it comes to kids announcing that actually they just got it quite spectacularly wrong for a long time. And the only one, which is my pet favourite, is the A lens or omega K tension, which I tend to talk about, which may come later. But nevertheless, people have been talking about tensions for a very long time, and accurately quantifying tensions between data sets, because you talk about tensions between data within a model, you talk about the evidence for a model from a data set, and you talk about tensions between data sets for a model, and addressing any tensions that agree, because in general, if you find one probe saying H0 is 73 plus or minus 1, and one probe saying that H0 is 67 plus or minus 0.4, the one thing you can be sure is that at least one of them is wrong. Somewhere someone has gone wrong because those two should be consistent within the same model. So either the data is wrong or the model is wrong, and understanding those differences is key to working that through. And ideally you do this systematically where you look for any tensions that might exist, because we've been trying to fix the H0 tension in lambda CDM for a very long time, but it could be that if you look at patterns across different models or different data sets, it reveals an underlying systematic that's there. So I'm going to talk briefly about global tension metrics. There's this gigantic confusogram on the left, but the key thing to note here is that this is South Pole Telescope, ACT, this is DR4 rather than DR6, and Planck. So these are CMB data. And here you can ask, are these things in tension or not? In that you can look at the green contour, and you can look at the orange contour and look at the blue contour and say, well, they kind of overlap in every parameter, but I kind of would rather that green be a little bit less on the edge there than it is here. Here it looks fine, this parameter looks less good, and you need to be careful about this because these are effectively 6-dimensional objects, and we're looking at the 15 two-dimensional projections of those 6-dimensional objects, and eyeballing them to go, if that parameter has a physical meaning, it can be very revealing that there's a break in H0. But if you come up with things that make it look, it is possible always to find parameters that look more in tension than they are. So for example, in this plot, I played the trick where I've taken the normal 6 cosmological parameters and defined the linear combination T of those 6 that is most in tension between Planck and ACT in this case. And you find the orange and the green look dreadful. They're miles away from one another, but that's only because in a 6-dimensional space, if you pick the right direction, the numbers of degrees of freedom you have can make them look quite separated. So when people sort of try to quantify tensions by picking one parameter, you should always be extremely suspicious of such a thing, because in general, in a name where the more interesting the paper, the higher the tension, the more interesting the paper, people will tend to gravitate towards parameters that make that look worse than it is. So unless they picked a parameter that's definitely a physical thing, you want to be careful about considering single parameters to assess tensions. There's now a relatively established literature on how you define tensions in the full 6-dimensional space or the full 10-dimensional space, or however many parameters you have varying. The trouble is that usually, if you want to do this properly, so I am somebody that's, in addition to talking about tensions, has built a career around model comparison, or more precisely, tools that compute the things you need to do model comparison. So bear that in mind as one of my implicit biases. I'm a man that sells you these hammers, so if I'm telling you that this is the tool you should be using, you maybe take that with a pinch of salt. But model comparison hinges in a Bayesian sense on the Bayesian evidence Z. This forms the part of Bayes factors that you might use, and things like the Akaike information criterion or the deviance information criterion or the Bayesian information criterion are really poor man's versions of those things, basically. The Bayesian evidence is the real thing in which those things try to capture the Occam's razor effect that it encapsulates. There's also been significant discussion in the literature in the past few weeks from George and a few other people outside of cosmology on Bayes factors again, and I'm planning to write a paper reminding people as to why people spent so much time developing tools to do this. But yes, the key point is that this is expensive, and you need to be both skilled at using these tools and to have quite a large amount of computing power available to yourself. Now, Planck resolved this all the way back in 2013, incredibly, when they built what's called the legacy archive, which is that it makes no sense for everybody to run loads and loads of MCMC chains. We've already done it. What we should do is run our own MCMC chains and put them online so that you don't need to rerun them every time for every kind of thing you want. So you can download the MCMC chains and produce your posterior plots. And Planck did that across this incredible grid. And Anthony Lewis, by the end of it, I remember being as part of the Planck team, could turn around that grid in days because he was just so good at sort of he had so much computing power available and so good at the important sampling end of it that this whole sort of, like this first of 9 pages of things that he ran would be done in 3 days' time, basically, every time somebody corrected a sign error in the likelihood and we needed to rerun. Here, this is basically a grid of subsets or combinations of Planck data and various extensions to lambda CDM. So the base lambda CDM model, you put in various kinds of massive neutrinos, running of the spectral index, spatial curvature, tensor to scalar ratio. All these things are put in that big grid, and you can go and click on the PLA, now rather baroque sort of system that they set up in 2013, and download each of those chains in turn. This, however, does not include nested sampling chains because that would have been too expensive. So what I did was went and got a rather large DiRAC grant, which, for those that aren't in the UK, is an STFC/EPSRC allocation system for asking for large amounts of computer time that fits in the gaps of what people aren't using. So here I basically did the same thing, which is to say, you guys don't necessarily have the inclination, computing power or time to run all these things yourself, so I will run a large grid of cosmological models and datasets and their combinations for both MCMC and Planck, for both MCMC and a wider range of nested sampling models. So basically we have a systematic scan over models and modern datasets. This modern always starts to look out of date the moment we put it on the slide. But here, for now, the stuff that's ready is Planck, weak lensing, and supernovae things. And we're now in the process of extending this to the new ACT, DESI, and upgraded supernovae data that have arisen in the meantime, and the other weak lensing sets that are now reaching legacy status, so KIDS Legacy, HSC, and hopefully Euclid at some point in the near future. So if you understood what the Planck legacy archive was, which was a whole load of MCMC chains for Planck combinations and models, this is that, but with nested sampling chains, if you want to do model comparison, and a whole load of other combinations of models. So it extends the grid in 2 ways, by giving you model comparison and combinations of data for searching for tensions. This is packaged up in a software tool that my PhD student Dily is working on. She's at the back there, and you can certainly chat to her in the break if you want to hear more about this. But in principle, this is a pip install Python package that you can then say download this combination of data. So that unlike the rather bespoke system for Planck that we had here, this is now just something that you can run with a few lines of Python to get your hands on various combinations of models that you can use to test which ones are in tension, or if you want to produce, say you've got your new fancy theoretical model, or you've got your new data set, if you want to grab the model comparison for Planck plus DES year 1 or Planck plus DESI year 2, that should all be there and downloadable in one easy grab. This is, we may be starting to get to the slides which look more like this on account of the fact that I was frantically assembling these slides towards the end of this. In terms of what this roughly looks like at the moment, it's basically, you install unimpeded, which stands for universal model comparison and parameter estimation distributed over every data set, and I made that artisanally before large language models. Okay, so here you would basically have your database explorer and be able to download samples, so Planck, SDSS, which corresponds to the SDSS DR16 baryon acoustic oscillation things, and their combinations. So this is the thing where you can get both nested sampling, the individual data sets, and the combination of them run in turn, which is what you need in order to compare tensions in a Bayesian way. So preliminary, this is an extremely expensive plot. There's a lot of HPC time that's gone into this, but on the y-axis you have models, lambda CDM, curvature, neutrinos, massive neutrinos running the spectral index, tensor scalar ratio, W is not -1, that's another neutrino one. W0 WA, this is the one that's been obviously in people's archive inboxes for a lot since the DESI release, and then A lens lambda CDM, and then here a subset of the things that we've run. There's a lot of detail here. The color corresponds to sigma of tension, okay? Very broadly interpreted, with kind of the most bright being 3.5 sigma. Coming up here, for example, the biggest one would be curved models for Des versus Planck and curved models for H0 versus Planck. So H0 and curvature is pretty bad in the global tension measure. H0 being the Rees result from when I started the chain. Actually worse in curvature, but not much worse than lambda CDM. And similarly, you're seeing it particularly bad there. So these tensions show up in model-specific ways, which suggest something is amiss. I'm not going to go through the amount of detail that's here, but if you want to, yes?
Tension between what?
Between the two data sets. So for example, here, you would ask, is there any tension between Planck and Des year 1 in this global tension measure for lambda CDM, and it comes out as about 2.8 sigma by this measure. That's the idea. So you kind of got pairs of models here, so pairs of data set here for all of these different standard models that are available in Cavallo, basically. What else to look for? Okay. Why might there be tension? And this is now my sort of example as to why I think tensions exist a lot in our literature. And it's not necessarily what people think, or as adversarial as I often come across. The trouble is that many of the traditional analyses have fiducial lambda CDM, more specifically flat lambda CDM assumptions in them. And that is not because people aren't trying hard, it's because it's actually really difficult to do that in the first place. And the idea of rerunning it for all these other models, when there's no guarantee it will fit better, is enormously difficult. It takes a lot of time. And in general, the codes not only get a lot, it's not a big duplication of labor to rerun your analysis for different fiducial cosmologies, it's also usually a lot slower. So there's a big computational barrier to actually extending these things to a proper evolving dark energy thing, or a universe with a real neutrino model in. These things get very expensive, and therefore people are twice shy of trying to extend beyond lambda CDM. They generally will run lambda CDM and then do a few things that check the non-lambda CDM cases and then say, well, lambda CDM is the best model, when in fact, if you analyze it carefully, those fiducial modeling assumptions have crept into some of the analyses. And if you read the literature carefully, it is there. It's there, and people do comment, here we know we're not doing this right, but here these ones are all fine. And the ones that we don't know, we then sort of leave to a later day. So unimpeded grid doesn't solve this, but it does start to reveal where some of those patterns are between what data sets are not necessarily working outside of the lambda CDM regime. Here's my pet favorite. This is Planck, and this BAO is the BAO at around the time of Planck, so this would be an SDSS before DESI. And this here is spatial curvature and H0. And if you take Planck without CMB lensing, the Planck papers say this is what the spatial curvature value is from Planck without CMB lensing. It is pretty curved, and people know this. This is well established. If you add in CMB lensing, it drags you into this green curve. And if you then add in BAO, it snaps you directly onto the flat universe. So from this, you would say the universe is flat, okay? Because BAO plus Planck say that. But looking at this, the orange and the blue are not combinable, right? These are definitely in tension in the same way that whatever H0 is, it's not 70, because if you've got 67 and 73, the midpoint is not the right answer, okay? And I'm not saying the universe is curved, I'm just saying that our standard analysis for why it's curved doesn't scan as a bit of analysis. And even that first stage of where you add in CMB lensing in curved models is a bit fishy. It's at like the 2.8 sigma level, the kind of idea that the tension between CMB lensing and CMB primary is about 2.8 sigma in curved models. Not in flat models, it's fine there, but in curved models, because to do the lensing analysis, there are fiducial lambda CDM assumptions, it drags you back there. Similarly with BAO, there are fiducial in both how you compress the data and how you get to your radial distances, and in the subrastatistics along the way, you often have to assume lambda CDM to get there. That's also true, not just for curvature, but for W0 WA. So a lot of those things assume lambda CDM at some point, and it'd be interesting to relax those assumptions, and nobody does because it's difficult and fiddly and it's easier to not. Right. Another pet peeve I have, whilst I've got your attention, blinding, okay? This is, in my view, a sociological contagion. In that I've sat through so many talks on blinding where people will talk for a very long time about how it's really important to blind your data, and there'll be a big sort of 5 or 6 slides on the blinding procedure and things like that. But in practice, when everybody does this and unblinds and finds that it's a bit wrong, they then go ahead and start tweaking. Now, of course, they're very honest about this. In the paper, they say pre-unblinding, post-unblinding. But if you're doing the post-unblinding analysis, you've invalidated everything about those first few slides of a talk on blinding processes, basically. So here, this is the rather cryptically named extended cuts figure in ACT, okay? One of the things I was fascinated by in in the ACT DR4 release is that it released an NS value, this thing which if you're an inflation theorist like me, is absolutely critical, of 1, like quite significantly 1, and very much not the Planck value. Planck says it's 0.96, and ACT DR4 said NS is 1. And it was NS is 1 to the tune of about 2.8, 2.9 sigma or so. This was not a small sort of thing, yet they you know, if you talk to the ACT team or the Planck team, they'd say, oh, well, ACT, of course, doesn't measure anything at high L. Sorry, it doesn't measure anything at low L, so it doesn't have the lever arm. But if those error bars mean what you say they mean, that fact that it was still saying NS is 1 plus or minus a bit matters. This is the DR6, the latest ACT release, post-unblinding, okay? It's still 1, okay? And I'm not saying NS is 1, but then they go and fiddle with the data to make the error bars big enough to go back to Planck for post-unblinding analysis. So all that stuff about blinding is absolutely nonsense. It just doesn't mean anything. Please stop giving me talks about blinding if you're not going to do it in practice. So again, openly available chains analyses like ACT do and like Planck do and like DES do really help to aid in this community scrutiny, and hopefully these will continue to do that. One of the things that we intend to extend the grid to do is to include machine learning enhanced bits of this, which is where you, in the same way that you can have Cosmo Power speed up CAM, you can have a machine learned emulator speed up the likelihoods effectively, so that in addition to downloading the posterior, you could also download a sped up compressed likelihood. So if you've ever used the Planck versions of the light likelihoods that don't have nuisance parameters, things like that. This is a way of distributing nuisance-free likelihoods at scale that are fast and able to run quick analyses. So again, this is not ready yet, but will be hopefully in the next year or so. And this is a slightly more open slide that's a little bit less specific to cosmology. So if I were to say the 3 emerging things that are going to really transform what we do, or I hope would transform, simulation-based inference has been around now for a few years, and 2024 was the year when you saw several serious teams like DES, like KIDS, like HSC use full SBI analyses and showing that it was either the same or better or worse, and understanding which. The reason why I would say simulation-based inference, for those of you that are familiar with it, the fact that you have a forward model makes it much easier to explore systematics and things like that. And this problem of fiducial lambda CDM biases is lower if you do have an SBI pipeline. So if you have a pipeline where you can go straight from simulations to posterior constraints, you don't need to worry about baking in a fiducial lambda CDM compression statistic as part of that if you're careful. The other theme that you're going to see over the next 5 years or so, which is not consensual, but all of the hardware that we're given, driven by the machine learning, the veracity of machine learning, will be GPU related. We're not going to get many more CPU supercomputers. For the next 5 years, a lot of these are now going to be GPUs, and that's where all of the power is going to be. So whether we like it or not, as scientists, we should be switching our codes over to GPU-capable machines that can use these. So if you... So the old world, where you had big systems of hundreds of CPU cores and things like that, just is no longer going to be provided new and will decay over the next 5 years. There are a few things for doing this, but one of the things that my group's been working on that I'm very pleased is we've managed to take nested sampling and put it onto a GPU in blackjacks. And we have very deliberately, for those of you who here has used nested sampling in the past in any context, so there's a few people here. So there's generally a social phenomenon of writing a nested sampling paper, which is name of nested sampler, : the best ever nested sampler you're going to see. So that might be multi-nest, it might be polychord, it might be dynasty, it might be ultranest, it might be nautilus, it might be all these other kind of things. The idea here is we're trying to dissociate ourselves from this and make it the open source nested sampler that we all contribute to in JAX. If you want to have a go with this now, this is ready, and it can run, if you have a JAX likelihood, it runs tens of thousands of times faster than the usual analysis. So it is jaw-dropping, the kind of things that we can do with this. Over in the gravitational wave field, we believe that for follow-up, where you hear a gravitational wave coming, you can run an entire net sampling analysis in the seconds you need to go and point telescopes at it, whereas previously it takes days. And then the biggest frame that I think is still something that people are waking up to gradually is large language models, okay? I made this talk this morning with large language models, okay? From scratch. There's no slides that I've presented before. All I did was feed it a lot of information, and I'm a skilled prompt engineer, and it made this Beamer talk in one go, okay? Obviously, I then have to go and sort of dig around for figures and things and put the figures in that I've mentioned in my prompt, but it made this. So first of all, stuff like writing talks, that makes that better. Less trivial things like writing grants, that makes that better. I have won several quite large grants. The majority of the grant application was written by a large language model with my input, significantly. But instead of it taking months, it took 8 hours. And the most interesting one scientifically, that's the kind of thing that's going to completely transform how we do science as scientists, but the most interesting one scientifically is that I know that if I weren't busy marking exams right now, I could write a GPU, CAM, or class in weeks, not years. So class and CAM took years for Julien and Anthony to write, but with a large language model and the agentic systems exist now, at the capability that currently exist, I know I could write a CAM or a class in JAX in, give me a month, basically. And that will only get better. So if you're not using these systems now, it is forgivable because the real capability only emerged in February, which is when they started having the capabilities that we prize from our PhD students. But that is now getting less and less of an excuse as we wander into May and June. So if you are not using these tools and not pivoting your whole workflow to use these, you should. Right. Unimpeded, that's now just about released. Talk to Dily if you want to hear more about that. We have basically of order 10 models and 60 dataset combinations and growing. We are currently extending it to the interesting stuff. So if you wanted to know what the Bayes factors actually are for the DESI, CMB, and other thing combinations, which they don't actually publish because it's too expensive for them to do so. There's only a couple of combinations that actually have real Bayes factors in. Those will be available soon. And again, continuing this idea of community-focused development in a world where holding on to code is going to become less and less relevant in a world of large language models. Here is the prompt, by the way. It's probably a bit small to see, but I've also put it up line on Indico so you can see the abbreviated one, which says, objective, generate a LaTeX Beamer presentation, slides only, with a core topic and narratives, target audience, stylistic guidelines, input materials and how to use them. The CosmoVerse workshop details, that's just copied from the internet. My talk abstract, the thing that I sent, an old talk that I've given to give it the primary, this slide structure, my DiRAC cases for support, my ERC grant, and basically this large, of order 200,000 token context window then creates this talk today, okay? I also didn't write this prompt. I wrote a rubbish prompt and said, please improve this prompt, okay? All right, thanks.
ChatGPT for some questions.
Well, no, actually. So I'm not that mad at this. There are things. So I would say for ChatGPT, large language models. ChatGPT is the child's toy version of this. What you really should be doing as scientists is using the actual underlying APIs and tools under the hood that don't look like a sort of a chat interface, basically, but still are. I would say that. The questions my heart yearns to know the answer to, the things I've been struggling with for years, it's still nowhere close to solving. Like, you know, I try hard. I've cracked a couple of problems working with it, but you have to push it so hard to move beyond the standards. So there's still a real role at the moment. And I wouldn't be so hubristic now to say that there's never going to be a world where they come up with new ideas, but for now, the real innovative stuff is just nowhere close to solving right now. So.
Hi. Thanks for the very nice talk, and thanks for being so transparent with the with the AI stuff. I think that's really important for scientists to say exactly what tools we use. It's great. And I have one question about the blinding, which is, don't you think that it's still beneficial to see what was pre and what was post, just to have more transparency?
Yeah, so the question is, isn't it still beneficial to blinding? Of course it is. Blinding is the kind of thing that we should be doing anyway. But people often act like blinding means this analysis is rock solid. And the fact that every serious team, i.e. the people that I respect, usually fiddle with the data after the blinding process shows that the narrative doesn't quite scan with what they do in practice.
Yeah, that's the risk.
Like, this is not marginal. And I'm not saying NS is one. I'm just saying that the blinding procedure did not protect you here.
Thank you so much. This was very interesting. I'm very excited to play around with unimpeded.
Yeah.
But I had this one question. So I was wondering if you thought about priors while setting up this ability to fetch chains and likelihoods and so on, because and I'm not talking about simple changing ranges of priors and stuff, but there are sort of more complicated prior masks which can completely change the posterior distribution. Like in W0 WA, if you impose a quintessence compatibility which looks quite non-trivial, it just changes where the posterior ends up and so on. So I was wondering if that's a feature which is even in principle possible for a pipeline like this.
So it's a very, very good question, actually. Much better than the usual question about priors, just to be clear. So as a rule, I've gone for very broad, uniform priors. Usually, what you would then try and do is, if you had a prior that was slightly different, you could imagine importance sampling away from one prior to another. That is better with nested sampling because of its deep tail sampling behavior. The fact that it has covered the tail to get there as much as you could, given the computational cost, means that it is more possible to switch between priors than that. But in reality, the way to really explore that would be to take the machine-learned emulators that we run. So you run the full thing on that data set. You then train a very powerful emulator that learns the shape of the likelihood profile. And then once you've got the shape of the likelihood profile, you would then be able to change the prior. So that's the other answer to your question. It's A, we are better at importance sampling than the current state of the art because of nested sampling that's in there. And B, the machine-learned emulators would be able to change the prior after the fact as well.
So I was wondering what it is the fraction of hallucination in the language model?
So the question is, what is the fraction of the hallucination in the language model? My answer would be, if you're using the Premier League of GPT 04 mini high or 03 mini high, if you're using the Claude 3.7 or Gemini 2.5, the fraction of hallucination is the same as a standard PhD student.
No, but really, what it is the percentage?
Pardon? So these things are agentic systems that check each other's, and particularly when they're then grounded on the internet, they actually go and check these things. So they don't hallucinate citations anymore. That's something that happened maybe 6 months ago. As of February and as of the grounding that comes in March, these things now are accurate at citing things, more accurate than a PhD student would be because they're more systematic.
Okay, thanks.
So I wanted to ask, regarding the comparison that you showed with your code, of course you have highlighted the situations in which you had the highest tension, but I've also seen in your plot that there are some cases in which you show zero tension.
Yes.
Exactly zero. And what is the reason? Is it because they use the same...
So the zeros are less bothersome. Usually it's that they're definitely fine, and the calculation and the number is dominated by estimating the numbers of degrees of freedom well enough. So here, these things are... zero is probably an artifact of me sticking this onto a sigma scale rather than me reporting, say, the Bayes ratio or something like that.
Okay.
So I wouldn't read too much into the zeros, other than they're definitely fine. So,
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, very interesting. About this particular slide, you said correctly before that with the Planck chains, you can't get the evidence from that. So in order to do this, did you actually rerun all the model fits for all the data sets?
if that sounds expensive, it was.
Very expensive indeed, yeah.
Not like Snake Win again.